once again, we've had three really contrasting and very interesting presentations. And I think, I mean, this chapter, it seems to me, is so crucial to the book that, you know, it's very important to see the mathematics as presented by Inge, particularly as she is one of the principal inventors of this. And then for Larry's questions and Diana's, to see some of the background work that Diana has done that reinforces some of these ideas as well is really fascinating. So who wants to start? You can use the hand, the electronic hand, which you can see if you click on the reactions button. You'll see that if you there's a button that says raise hand there, so you can sort of indicate that you want to ask a question. Who would like to begin? Okay, Lucio. You may be muted.
Hear me this way?
Yeah, we got you now.
Yeah, okay, maybe it was the headphones with problems. Okay, so I have a number of comments actually, so just to start with a couple of them. My first, okay, provided they find very intriguing the idea of defining meanings in terms of patterns of relations in a communication matrix. And I think this is a really fruitful way to approach the issue. It opens, however, a lot of methodological and conceptual problems. Let me try with an example. Okay, let's get a communication matrix. First question is, who are the nodes of this matrix? So who are the nodes of this graph, the isomorph graph to the matrix? People, okay, individuals. Probably we can imagine that this is a way to face with the problem. Okay. Well, if this is the case, that the nodes are individuals and the matrix is the matrix of communications between these individuals, when we are looking at the structural equivalence of these individuals, of these nodes in the matrix, what do we find? We find that there are, perhaps not necessarily, but likely there will be some subsets of people, some nodes that have very similar patterns of communication with the other nodes, with the other people. Mm. Okay, this is exactly the concept of structural equivalence. I mean, now, besides the fact that it can be measured in different ways, not only in terms of correlations, but this is a more technical issue that maybe we can discuss later. My point is, when we find that, let's suppose there will be in a matrix of 100 people in a community, let's say 4 or 5 blocks of people with very similar structural equivalence, so patterns of communication, where does the meaning come from? Mm. I mean, how can we move? How can we jump from the similarity in communication patterns to the meaning of the communications that these people share? Mm. And this is one first point that I would like to discuss with you. I mean, at least I miss the logical connection between the structural equivalence, that is the communication pattern similarity, and the meanings. Okay. A second comment still into this example is that, okay, we could also imagine that the nodes were not individuals, but where, for example, higher level aggregations, that is groups, for instance, or communities. So single nodes are not individuals, but are communities. And that's still very intriguing and interesting. But again, the question is, once we find that some groups of individuals have more similar communication patterns, how can we draw from here, how can we go to meanings? Maybe I missed some point, some logical connection, link in the reasoning. And stop here, maybe better. Yeah.
Well, I was going to invite Inge and Larry and Diana to respond to that. I just wondered, though, Lucio, if your question is really focused on meaning as a property of agents or meaning as a property of communications. Which do you see?
Of the matrix of communication.
Of the matrix. So as a property, so that may be a property of communications. But Inge, do you want to respond to Lucio?
I can try. Actually, partially I talked about it in my presentation, as I understood how the meaning is generated. Actually, I told that redundancy is not observed, and meaning is pretty much close to the redundancy. It's not. It could not to be observed at the initial position as well, but it could exist. And people during their communication, or actors communicating with each other, they communicate with some information and share the meaning, observable or not observable. And using their own communicational codes, they translate the message of another actors to their own way of understanding. And in this way, I suppose that they receive their own meaning for this information. The same information could provide different types of meanings for different actors.
Lucio, does that go anywhere too?
Yeah, if I can say something. Okay, but there is a jump, again, another jump. There is a logical missing link in my view from structural equivalence, which is very clear concept in network analysis, and the calculus of redundancy. And this is a double jump, let's say, acrobatic jump, because structural equivalence is a concept in network analysis referring to links, not to nodes attributes. Conversely, in all the part that is discussing redundancy in Loet's book and in Inga's presentation is referring to attributes of the systems or attributes of the actors, which is not a relational concept. It's in another orthogonal dimension, which is the dimension of attributes, while structural equivalence is in the dimension of relations, of patterns. I mean, so this was just exactly another of the comments that and the question that I would like to talk with all of you. That is, there are these two perspectives that I found both interesting, but not clear to me. How do they match into the discourse, into the book? There is redundancy in terms of entropy, and it is referred to attributes, and redundancy, or let's say structural equivalence and meaning as structural equivalence coming from the links. By the way, there is also a measure of redundancy in referred to links in network analysis, but it is rather different from the redundancy in terms of attributes, which is the typical Shannon-like or the measures proposed into the book for redundancy. So these are two different dimensions. Or I mean, ontological dimensions, because one ontological dimension are relations, and another ontological dimension are attributes of the nodes. They are orthogonal, I mean, independent one another, at least to some extent, independent one another.
So I want to ask Larry, but just to be clear, what is a link? What do you see as a link?
Are you asking to me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I understood.
Sorry, no.
Link, exactly, and that's exactly the point. One of the points to discuss, that is, let's make an example. Again, we have a community of people, of individuals, and the relations between these people into the community. These are the links. And we can imagine that these communications can be done orally, writtenly, or whatever. I mean, that is just what one tells the other, or one somehow communicate to the other. So the nodes, this I can see very clearly. The nodes are the individuals, and the links are the message that they send one another.
Okay, all right, Larry.
Or can be a network of companies on another level of aggregation, and the trades between them, or international network when the nodes are countries.
All right. I can see actually Diana's got a hand up, so I'm going to go to Diana first, and then I'll ask Larry what he thinks about this.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Lucio. I think about the systems in terms of communication systems. So for me, the nodes are the communications, and the relationships can be very different. It can be shared keywords, or it can be shared cited references, or it can be citing relations. So I see the nodes as the communications, and this follows also Luhmann, who says that it's not, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but it's not individuals that communicate, but it's the communication that communicates.
That's right. Yeah.
So perhaps if we think about the nodes above the individual, and the nodes being the communications, and the relations, some similarities, or some the links being some relations on those communications, perhaps it's easier. I don't know.
Yeah.
So can you make an example of communications as generators, as let's say, ontological entities that communicate? Because the point is, I can see pretty well how the many ways in which people communicate, or companies communicate, or organizations or countries communicate. But there is a generator of the communication, which is an ontological object somehow. Communications that communicate, that is, let's say, the disembodied communication perspective just proposed by Luhmann leaves me rather perplexed, let's say. I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
Diana?
Yeah, perhaps you can think of the scientific paper as a textual manifestation of this communication.
Papers do not communicate anything. People, readers of papers, people reading the papers then can communicate something through some ways. But papers are just bits in a computer, or papers in the stricto sensu. I mean, papers do not communicate anything. in my opinion.
All right, I want to bring in Larry because I think we're very close to Larry's territory here.
Okay.
I'm not sure what, I'm not actually not sure what the real question is. Or why we're asking it, perhaps. It's, and I'm not sure, maybe this is completely off topic. But I think there is a question that needs to be raised about issues with measurement in general. I was trained by Klaus Krippendorff, the Loet references Klaus. Klaus written a book on information theory. It's something I had to study with him. He extended it substantially, as has Loet. I, in my dissertation, came up with a measure of disagreement using information theory. And what the conclusion I came to was that all of these measurements are imperfect. All they are is a way to give you something that might be useful. It could also be misleading at the same time. I remember a quote from Deming, the quality management guy, who said, if you can measure it, it's trivial. Now, he wasn't advocating against measurement. In fact, much of what he was about was measurement. But what he was saying was that the things that are really important, the things that are really profound in our interactions with each other are not, escape measurement. But that doesn't mean measurement isn't useful. And I think when you have a very large data set and you want to do something with it, you want to try to get some insight, you need some measurements, and this measurement of redundancy is one possibility for doing that. So I'm not, but it can be misleading. And I think that's what Lucio was pointing to. But again, I'm not sure if this is on topic or not.
I mean, one of the things about the redundancy, and this partly also comes out of the work of Robert Ilanovich, who obviously has influenced Loet, is that it is a kind of way of trying to measure the unmeasurable. It's a kind of way of trying to get at the background. And I mean, do you think, Larry, that that's possible? Loet talks about the imprint of meaning. When we measure, we're doing these measurements, we're trying to get a grasp of the imprint of meaning. You can't see meaning itself.
Yeah. When I look at an interaction, I see two sides. I see the content side, what's being communicated, or what's being said, but there's also the dynamics. And Shannon information theory completely ignores the dynamics, I think. That's why you need the next layer, at least semantic level, but I think you could go in beyond that to the communication of communication. And but the measurement is still useful. I mean, we use measurements all the time, every day, and we come to depend on some more than others, but they're useful. And I take my temperature, not feeling well, I take my temperature. It's useful, but it doesn't mean it can't be misleading. Also, I can draw conclusions that may be completely off base because it's just looking at one little thing. And there's so much else that's going on at the same time.
Okay, I mean, I think this is really important. Anybody else got any questions, whether a continuation of this topic or something else that's struck you?
Yes, I'd like to comment. It's Jerry Chandler. Okay, so yeah, I understand the confusion about why Lucio's question is being danced around, shall we say, or not being directly approached. And I think it has to do primarily with the meta-languages that are being employed by the different speakers. The meta-languages are using a different base vocabulary from which they are drawing their assertions and conclusions. And Lucio's point, I think, is very clear that the links in mathematics, the links are the relations, and the domain and the range are what are connected by the links. And this notion then, whether you use the term communication as a node, which I think is Lucia's point, and he can correct me if I'm wrong here, the node is the concept of communication as opposed to the concept of the message being the important thing. So the domain could be either the communications or the message. The relation depends on which of those you choose. And if you choose the message as being the most important and the communication concept as being secondary assertion, shall we say outside the consequence relation, then you're speaking two different meta languages. So it really comes back to the logic, in my view. I mean, I'm just spouting off here. In my view, the question of what is the nature of the consequence relation here in terms of the mathematical model that was presented.
Sorry, can you just, I'm not sure I understand that, so you can just.
Okay, well.
That may be just me.
No, no, it's probably, it's a very abstract concept that Lucia is presenting, and it's a very rigorous mathematical concept as I interpret his words. And if you're using different meta languages, you have a tough time drawing the same consequence relations. I run into this routinely in the distinction between consequences drawn from molecular biological considerations and consequences drawn by physicians who use that same information and draw a consequence about diseases. You know,
Okay.
they're two different consequence relations.
Yeah. I understand. Jamie, you've got your hand up. Are you going? Can you respond to Jerry or?
Actually, I am responding to Jerry, and I try because he said we're turning around the pot, and he wanted to be more specific what it was about. And I think we can even be more specific. It's actually not abstract. It's all very practical. It's about distinctions, and that gets us back to George Spencer Brown. And so the systems that I hear Jerry talking about is different systems of or schemas of distinctions, and whether we call them meta languages or molecular systems or biology, it is about the system of distinctions. And that gets us back to Loet's work. We were talking a little earlier about the Zaloot. He wants to avoid the problem of solipsism, but it was really about the psychology or field of psychology. Is it all happening in our head, or is actually something, or fantasy life? Is it corresponding to the reality? And so the way we address that question is by the distinctions we make in our models on paper. And so the paper or the artifact or the triple helix as it exists, that is something that's outside our body that everyone can look at, and that signifies a model of distinctions. And so I credit George Spencer Brown with alerting me to it, but also by confusing it, because he gives the impression there is this 0-1 distinction that can explain the entire universe, and Luhmann kind of follows him, while there is also the triangle of reference and the triadic semiotics, or just the way Peirce is talking about it, where he really develops a much more systematic system of distinctions. And so I think that Lucio is actually pointing out we have a system of distinctions where we kind of forget that it is a human being who creates and is part of this conversation, and that the real issue is two human beings communicating with one another without killing one another. And so here I rest my comments.
Okay.
May
So
I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, possible. Even if we accept the disembodiment perspective of Luhmann's, that is communication disembodied from human beings, the problem remains. Okay, let's suppose a network, I mean, a matrix of papers. So where the nodes are papers. Okay, let's accept it. We can calculate structural equivalence of papers referring to similar papers, to the same papers, which is just exactly the concept of structural equivalence. Now, again, my question is, how do we go from a measure of structural equivalence, so it is blocks of papers who are referring to the same papers into the matrix of papers communication? How can we go from there, from structural equivalence to meanings? I'm still missing this logical.
Okay, so where's the problem here? I mean, is it, okay, so here's an open question. Is it to do with our understanding of networks? Because, you know, we have an understanding of networks where there are nodes and arcs, or nodes and connections. We know that you can't have a node without an arc. They're codependent. And that understanding of networks came from biology, early 20th century or late 19th century. People saw, you know, neural structures and so on, and that fed into cybernetics. But there was something that, I don't know, the processes of those biological network formation, those processes, which I think are very much what Loet is interested in. It's the conditions within which connections are formed. Those processes were somewhat overlooked, I think. And so we've ended up with this kind of ossified network. And it doesn't quite fit.
I'm not contending that I said as premise that I find this approach intriguing and fruitful. I'm just asking for your help to fill in a gap, at least in my mind, from the measure. I mean, this is a very methodological, but also conceptual issue. That is, it is very clear to me, I use it almost every day in my research, the concept of structural equivalence, okay? And I can do it, no problem. Now, my point is, how can I do from structural equivalence to meaning? Which is exactly the point that is into Loet's book. I mean, at the beginning of the chapter, that is, let's see, I mean, that he proposes correlation, which is one of the measures of structural equivalence. And it's okay, can be with others, but it's very clear. So blocks of nodes who have similar patterns, direct or indirect patterns of communication, I mean, of relations with the other nodes. But the point still is in. So how can we draw from structural equivalence to meaning? Let me give you a practical example in my research field, which is just, let's call it industrial economics or something like that. Let's say an industry, no, with many hundreds companies. I can calculate the structural equivalence of the network between these companies in, let's say, trade network, and find that some of these companies are very, very structurally equivalent, while others are not. Good. In my research, I would say these companies, structurally equivalent, probably they share the same strategies or the same approach to the market or the same something. And it's very clear, the use of the concept of structural equivalence. Now, I would like some support to understand when I move from a trade network to a communication network, to understand how can I move from structural equivalent nodes to meanings.
Okay, so would those companies have similar amounts of variety if they're structurally equivalent.
Variety, but Mark, variety is in the ontological dimension of attributes, not of nodes, not of links. I mean, the ontological dimension of links look at relations between nodes, regardless of the attributes of the nodes. The ontological dimension of attributes, which is the Shannon's perspective, looks at the attributes at the nodes and is measuring actually how many times the same trait, let's say, the same characteristic, the same feature is repeating into the set, and calculate the entropy with a very well-known formula. But that's looking at attributes, not looking at links. That's what I'm trying to emphasize in this discussion. We are mixing two ontological dimensions of reality, relations and nodes. Maybe it's possible to do it, but how? And at least it's not clear to me how to move from one to the other. And by the way, again, there are measures of redundancy referred to links. Why don't you use those measures instead of Shannon's measure?
Well, look, if I can reflect on my experience of listening to you, I have the feeling that you're saying something important, which I don't fully understand, but which I need to go away and think about. So I don't know if anybody else has a similar experience to me at the moment. But I mean, the only reason why I mentioned the variety of those organizations which have similar structures is that if they have similar variety, then presumably you would expect some sort of mutual redundancy between them, wouldn't you?
Redundancy in terms of what?
Well, redundancy in terms of their unrealized communicative options, or their unrealized options for unrealized options for communication.
Okay, there is a connection. I propose this to the discussion, which is somehow evoked at the end of the chapter of Loet's book when talking about triadic closure. And the connection is about what in network analysis, in social network analysis, called homophily. Homophily means that if some nodes are similar in terms of attributes, there is exactly the ontological dimension of attributes, individual attributes. If they are similar in terms of attributes, most likely they will connect with the same other nodes into the network. So this is the basic assumption of the homophily, let's say, homophily hypothesis, homophily assumption. And actually, in social networks, it is found this. So if we are similar, probably we connect we have similar patterns. This is actually an intriguing link between the ontological dimension of attributes and the ontological dimension of relations. So I think that the passage, I mean, the connection could be done also in the perspective of Loet's proposal, theoretic conceptual proposal. I'm trying to develop it with you, and I mean, that's just what I'm offering to the discussion.
Yeah, no, this is great. Yeah, I think I don't think we're going to. Well, does anyone have anything to add to this or any other questions? You know, but I think that there's something very important to sort of bookmark here, it seems.
I know we haven't been doing this, but I'd be interested in Loet's response to that.
Yeah, actually, maybe that now is the time to ask for this, Loet.
I have to unmute myself. Yeah, I would try to respond to Lucio in terms of first order and second order dynamics. So at the first order dynamics, I would completely agree with your distinction between attributes and relations. And then in the second order, I would say, what are the attributes which you can attribute to relations? So there, following up on what Diana was making as a point, that the communications are the agents, and the attributes then again can be related, and then we have the notion of eigenvectors in the background. Or you can also use your example of triadic, the triplets, that structures of communication begin to operate on feedback, emerging first, and then feedback on the underlying, what I would call first order. So it's all the time both and in parallel. Is this answering somewhat?
Can you give an example, please?
Yeah, the easiest example and the most close for me is following up on Diana again, scientific communication. So there you have agents talking to each other. Then there can be codification in what is being talked about. And that's what is then the code of the communication, closes off the possibilities for agents to talk. So you cannot say, some things you can't say and other things you can say. And that's not regulated at the level of the relations, but at the level of the, what I now call the eigenvectors of the, or the eigendynamics of, yeah, I think these are important concepts which we are familiar with.
Yeah, I know very well. By the way, I would suggest that what you refer, Loet, into your theory, it is more what is called regular equivalence than structural equivalence. Just because you yourself underline that what matters is not necessarily direct connections, but also indirect connections. That is just the logic of the eigenvector. And that is called in network analysis usually regular equivalence. That is, we are similar, not necessarily because we connect exactly to the same other nodes, but because we cover, we play a same role into the network. So exactly as you say in the book, we can even don't have any direct contact, direct link one another, but we can be regularly equivalent. We can be equivalent because we are connected in the same way, in the same patterns to the rest of the network. This is more what is called regular equivalence. And actually, I mean, it fits much more into your even technicalities. That is the point that is centered in using correlations, because actually regular equivalence usually is measured in terms of recursive correlations, which is just an eigenvector of correlations. This is exactly the.
Let me quickly respond and then shut up again. So I'm perhaps trained in a different semantics than you, because structural equivalence is also used as factor analytic concept. And
yeah, but
they're very close.
Are also regular, not necessarily
the regular equivalence.
Regular does not need direct connections.
Okay, I'm not so much familiar with that regular equivalence. I have never seen and not seen defined yet. But okay, I'll look into that.
Okay, just a suggestion, because I mean to define to fit better.
Okay.
To your.
The point is that the network is built up in terms of relations, and then it ends up to have an architecture. And this architecture feeds back on the relations. That architecture is a structure of eigenvectors.
I totally agree on this, absolutely. And I mean, I share your general approach to the issue and the logic of trajectories, regimes. We will talk in the next meeting, and it's something very familiar to my work. The point again is a question of how to extract meanings. And calculate redundancy. But I think it's too boring maybe for the group to insist on this point. Maybe we can discuss separately.
We have an eminent scholar in Inga Ivanova present here. I think we should turn to her.
Inga?
Could you clarify the question, please?
I can't hear it.
Loet, can you clarify the question that you feel, Inga?
How does it lead to redundancy? So you have this double looping. You have the looping in the first dynamic, in the first cycle, and the looping of the results of the first into the second order.
Actually, we deal with information as a first step, and information add to the uncertainty. It's increase uncertainty, but redundancy could be connected with meaning, and it decrease our level of uncertainty. And we can make some calculation where the calculation of entropy measure using the probability factors. I suppose this is the answer. So pay attention to the probabilities. We can measure how, to which level, the level of our uncertainty is decreasing. The more we know, the more information we have. The more information we have, the more opportunities we have to deal with this information, to understand it.
If I can add something, Mark, you are the moderator.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So my suggestion is to leave Shannon's measure, which in my view is not consistent with the rest of the approach into that chapter, which is in terms of networks, and use appropriate measures of redundancy referred to links. So links redundancy and not attributes of the node. Nodes attributes redundancy. This is also some operative suggestion. So why don't keep consistent with the network relational approach and measure appropriately redundancy in the right way, which is, for instance, one of the measures is the number of independent cycles, linearly independent cycles into the network. That's exactly the measure of redundancy, and it's totally fits into the logic of cybernetics and second order cybernetics, because the concept of self-organization is exactly this concept of cycles. So if a network is a tree, for instance, it has no cycles and there is no self-organization. Self-organization occurs only when there are cycles, so recursive, there are loops into the network. And there is one passage of the book in which Loet underlined that point, just referring to Klaus Krippendorff in that point. And I think my suggestion is to follow exactly that path of developing the discourse in a consistent logic in terms of relations, redundant relations. That redundancy is opening the space for different multiple future meanings, which is exactly the second part of the chapter.
So Lucio, are you thinking of Krippendorff's constraint analysis? You know, those funny diagrams that he drew. I'll have to find the reference. Do you know the ones I mean?
No. Actually,
I'll see if I
I'm
can
not
find
familiar
it.
with that. Sorry.
I think, Lucia, there is room for a new paper.
Well, there we are. That's the best outcome of this kind of discussion, I think. Anybody else want to change the subject? I do have a question about Brooks and Wiley, if nobody else wants to say something. Okay, so I'm going to ask my question about Brooks and Wiley. Inge presented I mean, chapter 4 is brilliant because of the diagrams, I think. And one of the most impressive diagrams is the one that Loet developed from the Brooks and Wiley graph, illustrating the difference between maximum entropy and observed entropy. And Loet explains how technology increases the maximum entropy, which seems very sensible, obvious to me. But what puzzles me, and you know, just from practical experience of working in a field of technology and education, is that the assumption that the observed entropy continues to rise as the maximum entropy rises due to technology doesn't seem entirely to fit our experience. That actually sometimes it seems entirely possible that the maximum entropy, particularly as a result of technology, could rise, and actually the observed entropy within our systems, our social systems, might fall. And I wonder if we've seen this in social media. There's been some fascinating revisiting. Heinz von Förster had this, he made a conjecture that said, you know, the more you turn people into trivial machines, the more overwhelmed they become with the complexity of the system that they're in. So I just want to know, Inge, I don't know if you can say a little bit more about the Brooks and Wiley diagram.
Yes, you're right, Mark. The observed entropy is increasing over time, and the maximum entropy is also increasing over time. So the difference between the observed entropy and the maximum entropy could increase as well. It could increase and decrease. It's our redundancy measure. And the speed of its increasing rather higher for social economical systems that deal with self-organization factors, self-organization techniques, or how to say, rather than for technical systems. So the speed is higher.
Okay, but is that what we see? I think that's my question. Or do we actually see a reduction in observed entropy, particularly within our institutions, as the maximum entropy produced by technology increases?
We can not to mention it by our mind, but we can observe it and keep in mind without any understanding. But then, thanks to technological progress and some other features that we have in our modern life, we can understand and use it in our future, even without understanding. We can use it without understanding as well. It's called technologically feasible.
It's called technological?
Feasible factors.
Okay. I'll post a link into this paper that I've been reading about social media, because it's absolutely fascinating in terms of the suggestion is in this paper that it may be that we're seeing the maximum entropy, the observed entropy in our techno-social systems falling.
think, Mark, if I may come in, we should ask Diana also to contribute on this.
Yes, sure.
Because are you still there, Diana?
Yes, but I got a little bit lost. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but perhaps Mark can ask the question again.
Okay, so the Brooks and Wiley diagram in chapter 4 is fascinating, and it does suggest that technology massively increases the maximum entropy of the system, which is a sensible proposition. But it also suggests that as that happens, the observed entropy in the system also increases. And I've been wondering about this, whether it might be actually the case that as the maximum entropy of the technical or socio-technical system increases, it may be the case that through various complex feedback mechanisms, the observed entropy in our social system actually decreases.
And I'm making the reference to you, Diana, because your empirical work is relevant to this question.
Thank you, Loet. Yeah, I would think that it would provide more options, but also like more structure, so that the observed redundancy would decrease.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my interpretation, but I don't know if that was what you had in mind, Loet.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about what's happened in the political discourse, particularly, there seems to be less variety. And we seem to have created a situation where things become polarized, and there's less nuance in the debate, and that we need to understand this. If that's what's happening, and if that's what's partly a result of the increase in maximum entropy, what are the mechanisms, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, but it's not only that there is less new things. I understand that's what you say, that there is less disturbance, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are also like differentiated communication channels for this disturbance to go on. So it's no longer something we all get, but particular groups. That's so the codes are more codified and appropriated by the individuals in the right answer.
Well, I mean, I agree. I think that's my thinking, and it's certainly, well, having spent a long time sort of thinking about universities and what's happening to universities in the light of technology, we haven't done anything to address the sort of, although there's lots of talk about transdisciplinary work, it's still extremely hard to get this off the ground in universities. It's still, people want their specialisms. They want to have very narrow fields of discourse.
But here I would go also to Loet's point that perhaps the organizational system is orthogonal to the communication system. So perhaps we as researchers want to do more interdisciplinary research, but we're still faced to faculties and departments and research instruments that are giving points to the faculty that has them. So I don't know if it's something to do with that, with the coupling of the systems of the way we organize our life at the universities and the way research gets self-organized, because it's a continuing discursive communicative interaction.
Larry, I don't know if you got any thoughts on this. I mean, what is happening to our social systems in the light of this increasing variety, or apparently increasing maximum entropy in our technical environment or socio-technical environment?
Well, my perspective is that when you experience increase in variety someplace, you've lost it someplace else.
Mm-hmm.
And in the overall sum, this is completely speculative, but I think cybernetic is we lose variety over time. Variety decays. So if I'm observing what you're observing, my first question is what are we losing?
Yeah.
In terms of variety. I don't know if it's a direct response or not, but that's what comes to mind.
Mm. Or how are we losing it?
Yeah, that's another question. I look at technology. I'm an engineer by training. When I look at technology, I say it both enables and constrains. Mm. We hope that what it enables is worth what it constrains. I'm not sure that's always the case. I think what we're losing, I mean, there's so many possible answers to your question, but among them, I think we're losing the personal contact with each other. Yeah. In ways that we may not even be aware. We just take the technology, we start using it like we're right here today, and assume that this is the same thing, or it's sufficient, or it's better, or at least it's better than nothing. But I think once we get familiar with this and comfortable with this, we start forgetting that when we're in person, we have so much more that we can interact with and for.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. That's very much in the spirit of the paper that I've just sent. So this is Heinz von Förster's conjecture that the more agents are turned into trivial machines, so the more that their communications are trivialized, the more that they will feel overwhelmed by the complexity of the system that they inhabit. But additionally, the more that those who are in a privileged position to observe that system that they're in feel able to control that system. And I think the person this paper is a couple of years old. The original work on von Förster's conjecture was obviously done a long time ago, but it's very relevant, it seems to me. And maybe there's something to think about here.
Yeah, I agree.
It's also time to ask Gerard whether he has a reflection. I'm sorry, Lei.
So then perhaps I might like to introduce the topic of metaphors, because what Heinz is doing, he's using a metaphor. So the machine metaphor, and we have a whole, we have a choice which machine we use. So he's actually, I think deep down, trying to, or maybe he's not, maybe we're the ones who need to wake up and say, this is a metaphor. How are we treating our metaphors? And so that's maybe a question to all the presenters of today. Have you considered that there are metaphors at work in your presentations, and how do you deal with that? How does one deal with that in general?
Okay.
Metaphor, you mean some crucial idea of the presentation?
A metaphor is when I say one thing to say something else. Like Lucio was using structural equivalence, and with structural equivalence as a word, you try to say, okay, those things are similar, but actually they're not. And so a metaphor is when I talk about something unobservable, like they did in the 17th century. So they replace this first there was the idea that there was a creator with a bunch of demons who were like in charge of everything. And now they replace it with the metaphor of a machine, and they say no, there are these causal processes of the machine and they're invisible, but they're like those of a machine. So
Okay. So my metaphor will be what is absent matter. I think it's a very interesting point, and actually it's not mine. It was proposed in Dickens' book Incomplete Nature, but I totally support his idea that the things that we don't know or don't understand actually has its own matter, and we can analyze and realize these things in the future. I pretty much like this idea. What is absent matter?
Okay. I'm just wondering if, I mean, I know there are people here who've been to the other sessions. So Richard, Stasha, anybody else got anything to add to what you've heard so far today?
No, thank you, but this was really fascinating.
What did you find fascinating particularly?
I think I observed this more, so I'm not an ethnographer. I'm more a quantitative person. So I don't know. I observed this as a very fascinating example of interdisciplinary discourse and how it goes. So I know it's off the topic, but it was just the interactions between the people and the issue of coming at topics from very different epistemological and ontological viewpoints, and how using different terms really, in a way, I'm not saying prevents, but makes conversation move sometimes orthogonally, as Diana has said. So I don't know how useful that comment is, but that was what was fascinating to me.
Yeah, there's been something very constructive about the discussion today, I think.
I
Diana,
mean, it was constructive, but also it's a fascinating case. If one would, like, this could have been a really fascinating case to write how things can evolve in the discourse of this type.
Yeah. Diana, do you want to, I think your comment about metaphors is very important, actually, as variety attenuators, effectively.
Yes, Mark, I was just looking at this paper of Loet with another colleague, Ina Helstein, which Andrea also knew, in which they talk of scientific metaphors as a way to reduce variety in the scientific discourse, but also as a way to bring the scientific discourse to the general public. So that was one of these kind of implications of the scientific of metaphors in the scientific discourse.
So how do you see them? Do you see them as a kind of sign of, I mean, a metaphor stands as a symbol that represents a concept that repeats, so effectively a redundancy. Is this a sign for a generation of redundancy?
Yeah, I would think so. I remember that when we were trying to try different concepts in which we could apply these measures, we did come with a paradigm as a scientific concept that has like been used in different disciplines, and precisely was that it's so interdisciplinary that it can also help as a code of communication, as something agreed upon in the community.
Yes, yeah. And see, someone like Gregory Bateson would help explain that. Gerard. You need to unmute, sorry.
Yes, I am there. To me, a metaphor is a much more dynamic thing. So when do we use a metaphor in science? We use it when we want to structure our experience in a certain way. So there is an intention to it. So I would like to emphasize the fact that in the discussion, the notion of intentions and objectives has disappeared to some extent for an obvious reason. It is not part of the scientific method. So my feeling is that when you introduce the possibility of an objective, immediately a lot of meaning gets a very different meaning because you are looking for something that you are not predicting, but you are constraining in such a way that within the constraint something new may emerge. Not immediately clear.
No, it just has to sink in, that's all.
I would like to follow up on Gerard's comment. It seems to me that he has hit the very same idea that I've been thinking about for the last few minutes, in the sense of that the nature of the mathematics employed brings a sense of closure to meaning. And I think that's part of what Gerard was talking about. The second part, which is obscured by the way he uses the language, but which I would translate into biological languages, and that is that communication itself, in its normal routine functioning, is creative. It's a generative capacity that is part of being in the interrelationships between the individuals or the corporations or whoever. So it's a genesis or biogenesis or symbiogenesis of meaning, that, or not of meaning, but of interactions, that is lost when you bring closer to the communications, closure to, for example, the entropy function or other forms of mathematical closure. So I think Gerard has hit a very critical issue here that I very strongly endorse.
So I would like then to point to a subtle wrinkle in it, that it really all depends on how we define science. What I hear in Gerard is this emphasis on prediction, or predictability, but there is also another way of thinking of science, and I say it needs to be reproducible. This whatever is being said, it needs to be said in such a way that anyone else can repeat the experiment and reproduce the same results. And so that it is that we kind of forget a little bit that in order to make something reproducible, you really need to think intentional about, will other people understand me, and will they think about the unobservable in the same way as I do? And that's where metaphors come in, because if we say that every human being is a machine, that's easy to understand, and then everyone will think similarly about the human being. But do we actually capture what it is about the human being that makes him a human being? And I think that this really the question that is put to the test today in the way the world works, or the world is dealing with conflict. So Gerard, what do you mean when you talk about science? Just where does your understanding or your definition or your training, philosophy of science, who inspired you or stimulated your thinking?
Well, I cannot be classified in terms of what I think about science because I am a professor of research methods. So I refer to everything that is possible. And in that capacity, of course, I meet a lot of people who cannot do the type of research that they are expected to do. I have a lot of PhDs and they always get into difficulties. So I think I would like to come back to Jerry Chandler. What I'm talking about is, suppose I ask you your name. That means I put you in an experimental setup and I expect you to respond to my question in such a way that I get a name. But in many situations, the experimental setup can be set up in this way that you actually require people to respond in such a way that the answer is unpredictable. So instead of claiming that things have to be reproducible, I am saying there are ways of dealing with human responses such that the answers are not reproducible. And they are still relevant because that is, and if you say who is your inspiration, people like Feynman, for example, is my inspiration. People who are actually creative in the sense that they step out of the traditional boundaries.
So what is the difference then between, in your mind, being predictable and being reproducible? And I'm here mentioning the philosophy of science issue that came up in the latest survey, their 10-year, their surveys they do every year, is that people stop believing in the idea of invariance, or that is kind of 50-50%. That there is a belief that science is about finding invariance, as opposed to maybe we should get rid of that idea and that's actually blocking our understanding. And that applies, of course, also to cybernetics and discourse research.
There's no reason to deny anything, but there is quite a bit of reason to explore where the boundaries are, what constraints are imposed by metaphors, the metaphor of scientific research.
And I would add to that that the issue of reproducibility, which is it's sort of standard preaching logic. It's we use the notion of in this country, the good Southern, certain religious leaders who take a very profound view of what's right and wrong and establish a set of ethics that is the boundary for behavior among that group. And the scientific community has been the victim of the same sort of logic coming now from the mathematical physicists who absolutely insist on the role of group theory and symmetry as being the basis of knowledge and science and everything. And this is very bothersome to me, very, very bothersome to me, because it leads to the destruction of the human spirit in the ultimate metaphysical sense, that man should be creative, man should be generative, man should generative in multiple ways, not just in bed. And so this notion of containing everything within certain set of mathematical symbols or beliefs about mathematical symbols is really, I think, it's deadening to the human spirit.
Well, on the topic of being deadening to the human spirit, I wonder if we should think about stopping. But I want to just pass the last word on to our three contributors. So Inga, Diana, and Larry. Inga, do you want to go first? Just a quick summary of what you think you might have gained by this today.
Actually, I want to thank Loet for the grateful book and wish Loet brilliant future and productive publication. More publications.
Thank you.
More books.
Yeah, and
a very good
sure,
health.
Yeah, I think we all echo that, and
Of course.
it's been great to have your contribution today. Actually, I know we've broken the rule, but it's been good. Diana.
Thank you, Mark. I didn't know there was a rule that you couldn't contribute.
It was sort of self-imposed, really.
I imagine. No, it's been a very fruitful space. I still go back to Lucio's, and we have also the last name, the first name. We could be related. I go back into his comments, and I think I didn't quite perhaps brought the issue of expectations that perhaps could also help. So I'm gonna work on that. I'm gonna reread the book and rethink about what you said, and perhaps I can come with a feasible solution. Thank you for the space. It's been very constructive.
Thank you. It's been very, very good. Larry.
I also thank Loet for the book. It's been a good source for learning some new stuff. If I take some link here to the next question that I'll be thinking about, it has to do with the word conversation. We've talked about communication, and conversation is another type of interaction, I claim. Gordon Pass said, conversation is not about communication.
Yeah.
It's the converse of control. How does that all fit into all of this? I'm sure there's many answers, and that's what I'll be thinking about next.
Yeah, I completely agree with you about conversation, I have to say. Thank you ever so much. It really has been a very rewarding session. Certainly from my perspective, it's really great to really dig into this stuff and look at it in some critical depth. This is an ongoing conversation, it seems to me, and that's what we're doing now. So what's next, Jamie?
Yeah. The next one is this the third Wednesday of March, March 16th, and we will be then discussing chapter 5 of Loet's book. And I need to look if someone else has it in front of them. I don't have it with me here right now. Let me go for it. I'm not immediately finding it, so if someone else has it.
No, I can't find it either. Sorry.
No,
What are you looking for?
I'm looking for the last. Yeah, I'm getting there. What we will have chapter 5. Actually, Lucio Beghiero and Yuzuo Kai will be talking, and it's about evolutionary and institutional triple helix models. And so we have two presenters. In other words, if any of you know of someone who would like to comment, perhaps there is some PhD student that is in the middle of reading Loet's book and would like to give a presentation. So please share the word because we still one slot for a presenter for the next book chapter. And if any of you feel inspired to give a presentation that have not signed up yet, for instance, Gerard, then you or Jerry for that matter, there is here an opportunity.
I have signed up.
All right. Thank you ever so much, everybody. Jamie, if you can send me the recording, because I don't have it, I won't have it on my computer.
All right. Sorry, Gerard, you're right. You're already listed for July. I was
Yes.
wrong here. Yes, you are
Sorry.
definitely listed. So my
Chapter
mistake.
10.
All right. No, I'm looking forward to that. And so, Lucio, we look forward to your presentation next month. And this, Mark, I'm going to give you the very last word.
Okay, well, thank you. See you next time.
All right, everyone,
Okay.
take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Mark,
Bye.
Loet,
Bye.
everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.